I'm talking today to Professor Don Searing, who is a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Don, what are the definitions of tolerance, and what are the different definitions that there have been historically and in the modern period?
Well, the oldest and most important definition of tolerance is the one that was really generated through practices in the Netherlands in the 16th century, 15th and 16th centuries, and was crystallized in a letter concerning toleration, which was written by John Locke in 1689. That definition suggests that tolerance means simply to endure people whose beliefs, whose customs, whose dress, whose practices of all kinds irritate you. It implies that there's an element of disapproval. You don't like it, but you're going to put up with it. To endure. And that's the traditional definition, and that's been the traditional definition that's come down and is the way in which tolerance is understood in probably a majority of societies in the world today. The more contemporary definition is one that you find in societies which are more multicultural. And increasingly in European societies, as they become more multicultural, they move towards this more modern definition, which is to respect people, to respect persons, to respect other human beings, and to be open-minded about their beliefs and about their ways of life, to make room for them, you might say, in your society, to make space for them to do what they want to do, to practice their way of life. And it's quite a different definition. It doesn't suggest as much disapproval. And it addresses the fact that we're all living together with all these differences. And it really is a reaction to three aspects of understand the concept of toleration that are important and try and sort out some of the confusion. It's actually a very confusing concept. It's been written about by very few philosophers, and I think that's because it's such a muddled concept, full of all kinds of contradictions, as perhaps we'll discuss. Philosophers consider it, peculiar, paradoxical, and equivocal. They consider it peculiar because tolerance is regarded as a virtue, and yet the people who practice it don't like it very much because they'd rather interfere with the people they're tolerating and get them to behave differently. And the people who are actually being tolerated don't like it very much because it sounds patronizing. I'm going to endure you. Yeah. And so they would rather be approved. It's paradoxical because it asks people to put up with things that they think are wrong. Yeah. And one of the biggest problems with tolerance is when it's even more than a matter of prejudice, but it becomes a moral issue for people. They're morally outraged by the way in which other people are behaving, living their lives, believing, and so on. And it's a very big problem. So,
because in the old days, what the German Jews used to say was a German on the street and a Jew at home, which meant out of sight, out of mind.
Yes.
So it's a private kind of culture and identity that therefore can be more easily tolerated because it doesn't threaten so much the other in the equation.
Yes, and that's been in the traditional definition of tolerance, to endure. That's been the usual demand, that in public the arrangement will be we will endure you in public so long as you conform to a considerable degree in public. What you do in private is your business, but in public we expect a certain amount of conformity, what the English call a decent conformity. And in more multicultural societies, that would be regarded as going too far, as demanding a bit too much. The third part of tolerance, aspect of tolerance that creates a lot of problems for philosophers and others in the definition is the business where I said it was equivocal. And as we'll see, tolerance often runs up against, is in tension with, contradicts principles in which most of us believe in liberal democratic societies, like majority rule. There's often a conflict between toleration and majority rule. The majority would often rather not tolerate, and if they voted on it, perhaps voted their preferences, they wouldn't tolerate whatever it is. And it also rubs up against community in various ways. The more community you have and the more intense it is, usually the greater the demand for conformity and the less the toleration.
And what are generally seen to be the limits of toleration?
Well, they're actually negotiated.
So there are no absolutes, really?
That's also very interesting about tolerance, that it's not an absolute value, that it's not an absolute virtue. The more of it you have, not necessarily the better. You wouldn't want complete tolerance, absolute tolerance. Obviously, you'd be tolerating pederasts and murderers. So what should you tolerate and what shouldn't you? And in every society, there are dialogues and debates about this. And some of the conclusions are enshrined in the law, some of them are enshrined in social conventions, and they change over time. There's, as we've changed attitudes toward women and toward all kinds of minority groups. These have been changed through struggles, political struggles, through negotiations and so on. Even in the beginning with John Locke, it was a big question for John Locke, what should be tolerated and what shouldn't. And he thought, for instance, you should not tolerate people who are out to undermine the interests of civil society. He also thought you shouldn't tolerate Catholics. But that
historically specific.
Yes, but that historically specific, and he may have been protecting himself. He had to flee to the Netherlands several times because of his ideas, and I think perhaps that was a defensive suggestion. But he thought definitely you should not tolerate the intolerant, and that's something that comes down to us in the present day, and is often one of the biggest questions with regard to toleration, to what degree we should tolerate people who are indeed themselves intolerant.
I want to move on to the ideas of Michael Waltzer, who wrote a slim but very interesting volume called On Toleration. In it he has a kind of typology of different types of regimes of toleration, he calls them. Describe to me the two that have the most relevance for the modern age.
Well, the two with the most relevance for the modern age are what he calls the traditional nation state and then the immigrant society. The traditional nation state would be something that would characterize most European societies, and indeed most modern liberal democracies. They're societies that have traditionally been fairly homogeneous culturally, ideologically, religiously. And the immigrant society, in contrast, is a society that is based on immigration. The examples would be Canada, the United States, Australia. And he thinks this is these contexts are very important and for distinguishing different types of toleration that will develop naturally in those contexts and are probably needed in those contexts. If you have a society that is really quite homogeneous, where there's a great deal of consensus on the way to live a life, in that kind of a society, perhaps you don't need or at least you won't not be likely to get the kind of modern definition of tolerance having to do with respect and with open-mindedness and so on. There'll be much more pressure for assimilation. And it will usually be successful. And traditionally in Britain, say, as an example, that was the case until immigration really, after the 1950s, immigration built up to significant numbers, and then again in the 70s and 80s, and then more recently. Until that period of time, immigration into Britain was really just a trickle. And most of the people who trickled in, Jews for instance, who trickled in, assimilated, and assimilated to considerable degrees, often changed their names even, which in a multicultural society, an immigrant society, would be regarded as, these days, as something that is outrageous to ask people to do, or to pressure them to do. But in an immigrant society, these groups are sufficiently large, and there's no dominant culture, there's no dominant way of doing things. And so these different groups end up with a live and let live policy and strategy. And that ends up, is reflected in the definitions of tolerance. In Britain, for instance, if you look in most English dictionaries, English dictionaries, look up the word tolerance, you'll see the first definition is to endure. And the second definition will be to respect people and persons. And if you go to America, and I'm not sure about Canada or Australia, but certainly in America, most American dictionaries, the first definition will be to respect people and be open-minded. And the second definition will be to endure, the older definition. And that's the kind of thing Waltzer is talking about. He's very sensitive to context and how a sense of justice or toleration often differs in different contexts. It adapts to the context. It can be context-specific.
And he talks about places like Lebanon where, in effect, different communities have formed an agreement amongst themselves in a particular way, and how that has broken down in the recent times and therefore is being renegotiated.
Yes, genuinely multicultural societies where there are territorially based groups have found it very difficult to endure and to be successful and to practice toleration, really. And that's been a big problem for Belgium. It's a problem for areas of France and for areas of Spain. So it's a multinational societies have often had great problems. In some senses, the Soviet Union was a multinational society that collapsed in the end and wasn't simply a result of its conflicts among its many cultures, but it was part of it.